Yeah.
Welcome everyone to the launch of the second volume of Thomas Keneally's History of Australia. With a book such as this, of course, it's particularly appropriate that we should acknowledge the traditional owners of this land, the Gadigal people of the Eora Nation. The first volume of Tom's history, in his acknowledgements, he says that it's his wish that Patrick Gallagher be as pleased with this volume as he kindly professes to be. Well, let me assure you, Tom, how about if I say that I'm as pleased with the success of Volume 1 as I was with Manly winning the grand final.
That's big.
No, the first volume of Tom's history had success and acclaim, all that we expected and more so. You only have to read all the reviews, which agree that Tom has brought the skills of a novelist to those of a historian, and the result is a book which is thoroughly researched, exhaustively researched in fact, and yet readable, accessible, and often fun. It's a wonderful read, and I can assure you that Volume 2 is every bit as readable and informative. Myself and my colleagues, particularly Rebecca Kaiser, who's shepherded this book through production, are in awe of Tom and how he wears his learning so lightly and is such a pleasure to deal with. On all our behalves, Tom, we thank you for this. And we look forward to the work continuing for volumes 3, 4. Tom's books have larger-than-life characters on every page. It does make you wonder how tomorrow's historian will deal with those on the national stage today. Do they have the same colour and life? One person who does, and will certainly feature when today's history is written, is Malcolm Turnbull. You don't have to be a historian to know of his stellar career. We're delighted that someone of his intelligence, insight, and first-hand experience of history as it's being made today is able to launch the book. Thank you. Malcolm.
Well, thank you, Patrick. Tom, it's wonderful to be here to launch this book. Tom and I have a great cause in common. We're both founders of the Australian Republican movement. Tom was the first chairman of the Republican movement. I was the second. Thereafter, Tom led the provisional wing of the Republican movement. and we're always, had to negotiate with each other about the destiny of that organisation and our great cause. Tom's contribution to Australian literature, world literature, and history is all around us, and it is a remarkable one. Patrick is absolutely right. Tom, you write like a novelist. You are a novelist, one of our greatest. But you can bring to history and history stories a passion and a humanity, the personalities and the people, to put you into the very place. It's not a chronology. There is a chronology in this book right at the end, but it isn't a series of dates and bills and battles and meetings. This book is filled with life. And not just the big figures, the Billy Hughes and Alfred Deakin, the founders of our nation, I guess, in a constitutional sense, certainly in Deakin's case, but lots of other characters. A wonderful, very sympathetic portrayal of Ned Kelly. This is the provisional wing coming out. The Irish get a very good run. Mannix gets a very good run. Although I'm not sure that Archbishop Mannix's Fenianism and passionate support for Irish independence, while in Australia, is much admired by Tom and by many others. But it certainly wasn't entirely consistent with his life when he was in Ireland, where he was accused of being somewhat of a castle Catholic. But let me say, the important thing about this book and about reading Australian history is that it gives us an insight into the enormous changes that our society has gone through on so many areas, the enormous transformations in a very rapid time. And it reminds us of the need, and I say this here in the School of Arts, it reminds us of the need to keep reading and keep learning. You know, we're here in the School of Arts, formerly the Mechanics Institute, which was one of the organisations, and Tom writes about these, established in the 19th century to provide what we would call today continuing education to working men and working women, although I suspect the men got into the education business ahead of the women in those days. And this tradition of continuing education is something that many people have lost. You know, we have a tendency, I think, often in Australia to think that, you know, you go to school or you go to university and then that's it. And you get some sort of vocational training and all curiosity comes to an end. But the tradition of constantly learning, improving your knowledge, not in a vocational sense only, but broadening your knowledge, is something that is a very 19th century idea. It's important to remember how many of our great leaders, Bill McKell, Labor Premier of this state, and of course the Governor General, was someone who came into politics with no education, the equivalent of an intermediate certificate, if that, but then went on over the years and read and learnt more and became a very erudite and scholarly individual, as I discovered when I interviewed him when he was a very, very old man and I was a very young man. So it's important for us to read this history. One of the things that we learn through this book and other books about Australian history, although there are none that I can think of that are so elegantly written as this one, he said in the presence of the author, are the continuing themes and the challenges that are often taken up, but then sometimes abandoned to be taken up again. One of the challenges, one of the threads that comes through this, of course, is that of water. Australians have always been obsessed with water. They've fantasised about inland seas. They've traversed the continent, Burke and Wills, Stewart, to find an inland sea, and of course found nothing. Thought nirvana had come when they discovered, as Tom describes, the artesian waters of in inland Australia. Only then to realise that even those waters had their limitations and the environmental damage their reckless exploitation caused. But in recognising the supremacy of water as an issue, we see great vision. You know, Alfred Deakin, talk about evidence-based policy. I mean, we need a few more Alfred Deakins in politics today, I can tell you. Alfred Deakin recognised there was an opportunity to increase agricultural production, increased opportunity for people to make a life on the land, yeoman farmers, if there was water. And he was inspired by what had been done in the United States. So he travelled to the United States, looked at their irrigation schemes, learnt from them, he learnt what to do, and he also learnt what not to do. He looked at the extraordinary, chaotic legal miasma of American water law, which, if I even began to describe, would empty this room faster than someone calling out fire. I promise you, it's a schmozzle. And he came back, learning from what had been done in the US, adopted the good bits, the irrigation schemes, and so developed Australia's food bowl in the Murray-Darling Basin, but also recognised that the legal approach had to be quite different, and so all water was vested in the state and, of course, licensed to landowners. And in that way, we've had far superior water management. However, there was one great opportunity with water that at that time, which was as is told in this story, which was overlooked, and that was in the 1890s during the constitutional debates. There was a powerful argument made that all interstate water should be under the jurisdiction of the federal government, of the yet to be constituted federal government. And the South Australians argued this with great passion because, of course, they were at the end of the Murray River. The New South Welshmen and Victorians, on the other hand, decided that, from their point of view, charity began at home and indeed ended at home, and they would have none of it. And so then that great opportunity on water was overlooked, and it was something that, to John Howard's great credit, in the last year of his government, we were able to remedy. And the management of interstate water is ultimately now a responsibility of the federal government. Because of that failure in the 1890s, the result was that all water management in New South Wales and Victoria was based on the assumption that if any drop of water crossed the border, it was a total failure in policy. and as a consequence, we had massive overexploitation of water and all of the huge environmental problems that we've been struggling to deal with ever since. The other interesting thread that is topical, I know this because the ladies and gentlemen of the press have been asking Tom and I about it, is of course the role of the Crown and the British Crown in Australia. And it is a very interesting thread, it's a very interesting story. And indeed Tony Abbott, while he disagrees with Tom and I on whether Australia should be a republic, pointed, I thought, very shrewdly to that changing nature of the Crown over the years, something he obviously regards as a great virtue. But it is a very interesting one, because when you go back to the period Tom is covering in this book, particularly around the time Australia became federated, the Crown was not seen as it is today as Australia's head of state. The Crown was the head of, the representative of, the symbol of the real political power of the British Empire, of which Australia was a subordinate part. Self-governing, but nonetheless a subordinate part. Alfred Deakin was praised, as Tom notes, praised, I think the British had mixed feelings about him, but he was recognised and respected, is probably a better word, for his standing up for Australian perspectives and Australian points of view in the conferences in the 1880s and 1890s. As indeed Billy Hughes was respected, although loathed by the Brits for his standing up for Australia's interests, particularly over colonies in the Versailles Conference. But nonetheless, in those days, the Queen in the Constitution meant the British government. It meant in exactly the same way in the days when we used to get letters from the state government demanding we pay a parking fine or a land tax or something, and it used to have OHMS on it, on Her Majesty's Service. It wasn't an invitation to hang out with the Queen in Brisbane or anywhere else. It was the government, the Crown, demanding money. That view is still reflected in our Constitution, and it's fascinating because someone raised this with me just the other day. There is still a provision in our Constitution that enables the Queen to annul any Australian law within 1 year of its enactment. Now that's an extraordinary, on the face of it, that's an incredibly anti-democratic thing. Why was that there? That was there because in colonial constitutions of that era, and they were all had these features, there was always a power for the British government in Whitehall to annul a colonial law which offended the imperial policies. If the Australians had passed a law that caused some huge diplomatic conflagration with friendly powers, the Brits had the power to annul that law and say, sorry, we've put you on a longish leash and we're now going to pull it back in. That's why that provision remains there. And somebody said to me the other day, well, if Tony Abbott wants to repeal the carbon tax and there is an election within 12 months of it being enacted, why wouldn't he just advise the Queen to annul the law without having to go through the parliamentary process? Now, that is, in practical political terms, an absurd proposition, but it does raise the interesting question of how those provisions came about. And of course, what developed over time, and Tom's history of this volume ends in 1919, but his subsequent volumes will tell the story about how the Crown ceased to be seen as the symbol of a British Empire of which we were a subordinate part, but became, as Australia became independent, rather the symbol that we were British. This is how Menzies described it in the 1950s, when Australia was on any view an independent country. Menzies said, the Crown is the symbol that wherever we are in the world, we are one people. And what he meant was one British people. One British people. Now, you wouldn't say that any longer. That would be, again, an absurd proposition. And so time rolls on, and the Crown, and indeed the Queen, the same person, is now held up in a different position as head of state, but a head of state that acts solely on the advice of the Australian government of the day. And of course that's really all the Australian Republican issue is about. It is about the question of that symbol. We no longer have to argue for independence, as the Republicans were doing in the 19th century, as Tom describes. We're no longer battling the British to determine, what belongs to Australia and what belongs to the King. We are a thoroughly independent nation. The issue that remains is we have a Queen of Australia, but is that Queen Australian enough? Is it as an office, as a symbol, sufficiently Australian? The Republicans obviously say no. I was asked earlier about the reception that the Queen has had here, which has been incredibly warm and generous, as it should be, because the Queen is one of the most loved and respected public figures in the world today, in any country, but particularly in Australia. There are very few Australians that can remember any other monarch, any other head of state for Australia. But in the lives of most of us, and certainly in my life, I was born in 1954, the Queen's role has changed in the sense that her perception, her function has changed, although her constitutional position, of course, in a dry technical sense, has remained the same. But then if you take from Tom's point of view, Tom's perspective, who's just a few years older than me, when Tom was born, the Queen was, as I said a moment ago, the symbol of the head of the British Empire, of which we were then a self-governing, but nonetheless a politically subordinate part. So these are great changes, and this book relates them all. There is one passage in the book about Billy Hughes that is worth reflecting on. Billy Hughes, of course, I said, was loathed and by many, loved by many others, respected, I think, by most people. But Clemenceau, the French premier, that certainly did respect Hughes. But one thing that he admired about Hughes was the hearing aid that he had. He had a machine that enabled him, to hear people. And Clemenceau thought this was a marvellous aid for any politician to have, because, as he said, when the conversation became disagreeable, Mr. Hughes simply turned it off. In an age of social media and the 24-hour news cycle, I don't think any of us can afford to be switched off even for a second. So, Tom, congratulations. This is a fantastic book, and I'm sure there'll be many more volumes to be written, filled with so many colourful characters, bushrangers, politicians, and even a few that are both. Thank you very much.